So the live at start.
So move.
Start.
Moving on now, it's time to learn about yet another fundamental concept that we use all the time in React development, and that is the children prop. So we have finished this project right here, and so we can basically finish this with Control C. So now if we reload, you immediately see that the connection has been lost, or you could also simply have closed this VS Code window right here. Okay, and now what I want to do in this lecture and the next one, as I introduce you to the children prop, is to use the steps component that we built before. So let's go back to the steps folder and open it up in VS Code. And again, you can do that in any way that you wish. Now I will now actually duplicate this file. So this app.js in which we are working, I will copy and then paste so that we can keep the first version of the code that we wrote. I'm calling this one app version 1, and so now we can continue the work here in this file. Alright, so let's here come to the terminal and then write npm start so that our project opens up again here in the browser. Alright, now, remember how we had actually included the steps component here twice, so let's remove or comment out one of them. And so yeah, it's gone. And as always, it's important to keep the console open and maybe also the components tree, but for now let's stay on the console. Okay, so the idea of this lecture is to create a reusable button that we can use instead of these two ones here. And I want to add an emoji to these buttons here as well. So let's take a look at where they are. Yeah, so these two buttons here. Again, I now want to create a reusable button that we use instead of these two. So let's do that, and we start by using the knowledge that we already have. So let's say function button, and then all this will do is to return a button element, which would also have this style here and an on-click event handler. So let's just copy these two here, and also let's place some text here for now. And so now the idea is that we can pass in the background color, the color, this on-click handler here, and the text as props. So basically we want to accept some props here for the text color. So let's actually call it text color. So text color, background color, the on-click handler, and also the text. And so then here, let's use that button actually. Before we keep working on the button, let's include it here immediately. Let's right away delete this one. And so we use our component that we are building right now. So let's say text color should be this one here. Or actually that's the background color.
I have 12.
Of course. So BG color, then the text color. This one should be FFF for white, and then also the on-click prop. And here we want to specify the handle previous function. Alright, then we close, and also the text. So here, this one said previous. And so now let's come to our button down here, and let's use these values here instead of the hard-coded values. So here, background color should be the BG prop that we received, and this one should be the text color that we receive as a prop. And here we want on-click, and here, instead of just this generic text, we want, again, the text that we receive as a prop. So let's give it a save, maybe reload even, and you see, as we use this button, it still works and looks exactly the same as before. So let's then do the same thing with this one here. So let's just copy and pasting this one and then changing the on-click handler to handle next, and here, next. Let's delete this button. And so now with this, we have exactly the same functionality as we had before. But we extracted these buttons that we had here into a reusable button component, which right now accepts the text color, the background, the on-click handler, and the text. So passing all these data here as props into this component should be pretty clear at this point, so hopefully you understood exactly how that works in previous lectures. But anyway, let's now say that we also want to add an emoji. So that's easy enough, we just accept it here as a prop. So emoji, and then let's add it here before the text. And let's actually create a span element for this emoji. So we create a span, and then in there, we put our emoji and then the text. Okay, and then let's actually pass that emoji in. And then let's here maybe search for finger, because I want this one here for previous, and then one finger pointing in the opposite direction for next. So that's this one. Okay, give it a save, and yeah, that worked nice. So we have our emojis and our text, and it works exactly as we specified our button down here. But now let's say that I wanted this emoji here to be on the left side, but the other emoji on the right side, so that it would say next, and then pointing right to the right side. So this we kind of have a problem, because we already have so many props. And so do you think that we should add yet another prop, basically for this direction? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's getting a little bit too crazy here with all these props, and we could keep adding more and more to customize this button even more. But I think at this point we should not add, for example, this one here, like for the direction or for the size of the emoji, and instead make use of the children prop that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. So instead of passing in this side here, this emoji and the text, which are basically the content here of this button element, what if we could simply pass the content right into the button as well? Or in other words, what if we could pass simply some JSX into the component, and then the component could use that JSX and simply display it? Well, we can actually do that in React. So let's come up here and notice how up until this point all our components have always been self-closing. So we never had like this and then any content and then close the element. So we never had this before. But in fact we can do exactly this. So just like we do with HTML elements where we have an opening tag, then some content, and then a closing tag, we can do exactly the same with React components. So here, of course I don't want that gibberish. Let's just put it back for now. But basically what we want is to now here write that span with the emoji. So this one, and then previous. So this is exactly what we want as the content of this button. And if we were writing the button as a simple HTML button, this is what we would write. So that's actually exactly what we did right down here inside this button. And so again, we can do exactly the same thing with our React components. So then we no longer need this and this. And let's then do the same thing here. And so now comes that part where we can very easily change the direction for the size of the emoji. Because we can simply write next, and then we put our emoji in the JSX on the right side. So easy, right? Well, I forgot to close our button here. Okay, and of course we don't see any content here anymore, because we no longer are passing in the text and the emoji. And so now it's time to fix this. Basically now it is time to give the button element access to whatever content we wrote into the opening tag and the closing tag. And so that's where finally the children prop comes into play. So the children prop is a prop that each React component automatically receives, and the value of the children prop is exactly what is between the opening and the closing tag of the component. So let's remove all of this, and then we simply need to write children. And so this really is a predefined keyword inside React. And so, as a final step, we can remove all of this, and simply use the children here. Give it a save, and there we go. Beautiful. We have exactly what we set out to build. We have the emoji here on the left side, and here on the right side. And of course, we could do anything here. So we could have even more emoji if the children prop comes into play. So the children prop is a prop that each React component automatically receives, and the value of the children prop is exactly what is between the opening and the closing tag of the component. So let's remove all of this, and then we simply need to write children. And so this really is a predefined keyword inside React. And so, as a final step, we can remove each. Okay, and now of course you don't see any content here anymore, because we no longer are passing in the text and the emoji. And so now it's time to fix this. Basically now it is time to give the button element access to whatever content we wrote into the opening tag and the closing tag. And so that's where finally the children prop comes into play. So the children prop is a prop that each React component automatically receives, and the value of the children prop is exactly what is between the opening and the closing tag of the component. So let's remove all of this, and then we simply need to write children. And so this really is a predefined keyword inside React. And so, as a final step, we can remove all of this, and simply use the children here. Give it a save, and there we go, and simply. Okay, and now of course you don't see any content here anymore, because we no longer are passing in the text and the emoji. And so now it's time to fix this. Basically now it is time to give the button element access to whatever content we wrote into the opening tag and the closing tag. And so that's where finally the children prop comes into play. So the children prop is a prop that each React component automatically receives, and the value of the children prop is exactly what is between the opening and the closing tag of the component. So let's remove all of this, and then we simply need to write children. And so this really is a predefined keyword inside React. And so, as a final step, we can remove all of this, and simply use the children here. Give it a save, and there we go. Beautiful. So we have exactly what we set out to build. We have the emoji here on the left side, and here on the right side. And of course, we could do anything here. So we could have even more emojis, even more elements. And yeah, we could do really whatever we wanted. Because this content here of this element would simply be passed as the children prop into the button. And then here we use that children prop to display all that content right here inside this HTML button. And with this, we just gained a brand new and really, really important tool that is used all the time in React. It's actually one of its most useful features, I would say. And the reason for that is that it allows us to make our components truly reusable. So with this children prop, I'm now able to pass whatever content I want into this button element. And the button component doesn't even need to know what content this is going to be. All it does is to take the children to all the content and all the JSX that we just passed in, and will simply then render it inside this button component. And so because of that, we can think of the children prop as a hole that can be filled by us passing in the content into that component. And if for some reason this seems strange, don't worry, we will use this children prop all the time, all the way until the end of the course. And now just to finish, let's quickly recap what we just did here. So, by using the children prop in the button component, we basically left an empty hole right in the component that we could then fill with any JSX markup that the component receives as children. But then the question is, how do we pass in these children? Well, when we include the button component in some JSX, instead of immediately closing the element, we can write some more JSX into that element. So just like we can write any HTML markup inside other HTML elements, right? So just like in HTML, we can write anything that we want between the opening and the closing tag of the component that we are using. So in this example, this piece of JSX creates the elements that are then the children of the button component, and they will then be accessible inside that button as props.children. So that's why we say it is the children prop. So basically, by defining child elements like this, we are passing them into the button just like we can pass in any other prop. The difference is in the way in which we specify other props, so the more regular props and this one. So by passing in content between the opening and the closing tag of an element, we basically fill the hole that we left in the component by using props.children in the JSX of that button, so of that button component. So if we think about this, the children prop is really an ideal way of making reusable and configurable components, especially when it comes to the content of the component. So for example, let's say say that we wanted to create a second similar button, but with some other emojis and text. Well, now that we know about the children prop, that is really easy. All we have to do is to pass in some different JSX, and then the button gets completely different content. And this technique is really, really useful for building generic components that do not know about their content before actually being used. Like, for example, a modal window, a generic slider, or simply a generic button like the one that we just built. So again, this button component had absolutely no idea about the content that it was receiving, and therefore about the content that it was displaying. And so this is really amazing to create generic and reusable components. So using the children prop like this is really an extremely powerful technique that you will need to master as you learn React. But we will use this over and over again, and so there will be plenty of time to practice. And actually starting right in the next video. Let's now build another reusable component by leveraging the children prop once again. And this time, let's say that you want a component to display a message. Nothing really happened. Of course, I mean, we didn't really return anything here. We just wrote some JSX, but we didn't return. We also get some warning here that the H3 cannot be inside of the P. So let's then replace this P just with a div. Give it a save, and there it is. Beautiful. So it always displays current step, and of course the message that we had before. Because we passed it in right here, and so that is exactly what we had before as well. And now of course we could reuse this anywhere we wanted. So let's say that here, after the step, we wanted somewhere else in the app also to have a step message. Let's say step number 1, and then here the content is pass in content. Let's do another paragraph with some emoji here. Does not matter at all what we have here. And so then here we have step 1 like this, and we can do as many as we want. So copy paste that, say for example step 2, tweet, children, prop, and then maybe some other emoji. Give it a save, and so now we have again created a reusable component here that we can use anywhere in our application and give it any content that we want. And it will always, as you see, display the step here with the number that we gave it, and then whatever content that we passed into it, into the component itself. Let's come back here, and here I just thought that maybe we could use our buttons again. So why not? And then it makes even more sense to have these different props, because now we can basically customize them in a different way. So let's say here we wanted a different background color and a different text color. These should be strings, like this. We're missing the on-click event handler, and so here let's just define an inline function, and the emphasis is again on defining the function. So here we need to pass in the function, not call the function. Let's just alert something here. It doesn't really matter. Let's say learn how to, and then we can just use this here, just so that it's related to each of the steps. So we opened the button, then we have the closing tag, and now we can pass whatever we want in here. And of course, this thing that we pass can also just be regular text. So give it a save, and there is our button. It still works, so we are successfully passing in the on-click handler and then using it. The styling looks a little bit off, but I guess that's because I styled those one here. Well, let's see actually. Just make sure there's nothing wrong. Yeah, in fact, these buttons get these styles because they are children of some element with the buttons class. Alright, but that doesn't really matter. We could of course wrap this in a div with the class of buttons, as might work, or maybe that will mess up some other styling. Well, that doesn't really work, also because it's buttons. Yeah, nice, that looks better actually. And so with this we can see that we were really able to customize, once again, our button here. Some parts with normal props, like these 3, and then the content itself here with the children prop. So if we always just want to pass in a string, this could of course also be a normal prop, but since sometimes we want some other content, like here with an actual JSX, like this span element here, well then we should really take advantage of the children prop. And now, to really drive this message home, so that you really understand how to work with this important children prop, let's go back to our accordion component exercise and use it there as well. Let's now take everything that we learned throughout this section in order to make the accordion that we started building earlier a bit better and a bit more real. Let's now build maybe customize them in a different way. So let's say here we wanted a different background color and a different text color. These should be strings, like this. We're missing the on-click event handler. And so here, let's just define an inline function. And the emphasis is again on defining the function. So here we need to pass in a function, not call a function. Let's just alert something here. It doesn't really matter. Let's say learn how to, and then we can just use this here, just so that it's related to each of the steps. So we opened the button, then we have the closing tag, and now we can pass whatever we want in here. And of course, this thing that we pass can also just be regular text. So give it a save, and there is our button. It still works, so we are successfully passing in the on-click handler and using it. The styling looks a little bit off, but I guess that's because I styled those one here. Well, let's see actually. Just make sure there's nothing wrong. Yeah, in fact, these buttons get these styles because they are the children of an element with the buttons class. Alright, but that doesn't really matter. We could of course wrap this in a div with the class of buttons, as might work, or maybe it will mess up some other styling. Well, that doesn't really work, also because it's buttons. Yeah, nice, that looks better actually. And so with this we can see that we were really able to customize, once again, our button here. Some parts with normal props, like these 3, and then the content itself here with the children prop. So if we always just want to pass in a string, this could of course also be a normal prop. But since sometimes we want some other content, like here with some actual JSX, like this span element here, well then we should really take advantage of the children prop. And now, to really drive this message home, so that you really understand how to work with this important children prop, let's go back to our accordion component exercise and use it there as well. Let's now take everything that we learned throughout this section in order to make the accordion that we started building earlier a bit better and a bit more real. And here it is. So just like before, when I click on one of the items, then it will open. But when I click on another one, then only this one. Let's now build it with the number that we gave it, and then whatever content. Let's now take everything that we learned throughout this section in order to make the accordion that we started building earlier a bit better and a bit more real. And here it is. So just like before, when I click on one of the items, then it will open. But when I click on another one, then only this one stays open, and all the other ones are closed. So basically what this means is that now each of the items no longer controls whether they are open or not. Instead, it is now the accordion who knows which of the items are open, and then only that item basically is allowed to be open. So for example, if item number 3 is the one that's currently open, then number 1, 2, and 23 need to be closed. So again, all of these items here need to know which is the currently open item. And so that means that we now need to move our state from the item onto the accordion. Now, I still have the code here from the part 1 of the exercise, and so let me know for this so I can basically leave the other part unchanged. But you can totally also work on top of verse 1. So then you only have that one. So let's now remove this piece of state, because again, now each item no longer controls whether it is open or not. And then we get a bunch of errors, but that's not a problem. For now, at least. So here let's now create that piece of state I was talking about, which will be current open. So here we will store the number of the item that is currently open. That is open use state, and we will start with null. So then none of them will be open in the beginning. So again, this cur open state variable will basically hold the number, so this number right here, of the item that is currently open. And so then we pass that cur open into the accordion item, and then from there it can calculate whether it is currently open or not. So let's do that. Let's pass cur open in. So use a prop called cur open to pass that in, and then we also need to pass this setter function in, so that then down here in the item we can set the current item to the one that has been clicked. And here let's use the convention we used before, which is to start with the on prefix. So let's say on open set is open. And now here let's then receive those props, cur open and on open. Here let's now the comment is out, get rid of this error right there. And then here, as I was saying, we can basically calculate whether this item is currently open or not. So we can say again it's open, or bringing back the variable name from before, and then if the number, so if the number of this item is equal to the currently open one. So in that case, this open will be true, and then it will be, well, displayed as open. So let's change this here from null to 1, and so that works. So remember that this one adds 1, and so this is 0, 1, and 2. So let's add 2, then that one is open, and then with 0, the first one is open. Great. So we created a state variable, we used it in the UI, this time by passing it into an item, and then using it to compute whether the item is currently the open one or if it's not. Alright, let's set this back to null, because of course now we want to update the state by clicking on each of these. Let's right here, let's get rid of all that, and then let's use our on open function. And here it's very simple. All we want to do is to pass in the number. So for example, if we are here in item number 1, then when we click on open, we'll run with number 1. And remember that on open is basically set is open, which should be called set current open. Alright, so we run it with number 1, and so then the state current open becomes 1. And then what happens down here again is that 1 is equal to 1, and so then that item will become open, and all the other ones will stay closed. For example, this one here, item 0, well, item 0 is different than 1, so its open is false. And that works beautifully. Great. And now this can be pretty confusing because we're passing states up and down. But this is basically just the idea of lifting up states. So before we had the state right here in each item, but then suddenly all of them need to know about the current state. So therefore, we can say that we lift the state up to the closest parent. Alright, so after this exercise is done, please take some time to analyze the data flow here in great detail. I'm just moving a bit faster here because we already learned about all of this, and this is just an exercise. Okay, now next up what I want to do is to use our knowledge about the children problem. To finish part 1 of this course, so the React fundamentals, we'll review everything we have learned up until this point by building this brand new project called Even Split. Now, since this is a bonus practice project, it doesn't introduce any new concepts, and so you can safely skip it if you're pressed for time. However, in my experience, practicing these fundamentals of state, props, and events is absolutely crucial for your progress, and also to understand all the content that follows in the rest of the course. So if you can, make sure to build this project together with me now, or you can even try it completely on your own. So as always, let's start by setting up a new project and by taking a look at the final version of the app that we're going to build. So let's fire up our terminal or the command prompt in Windows, and then, as always, we navigate. Welcome to the second section on how to think in React. This time, we'll learn how to think about components, component composition, and component reusability. So we're going to build this beautiful new project over the next few sections. In this section, we lay the foundation of the project by learning deeply about how to split a user interface into components, what type of components we can use, and then how to implement it all in React. We'll also build a simple app layout for the first time using the power of composition. And all these are already intermediate React topics, but still absolutely fundamental for any React developer. So if that sounds like fun, then let's get started. It's time to set up our next project. So we're building a lot of projects here, which is exactly what you need to become the React developer that you want to be. And by now, you already know the drill. So just fire up your terminal or your command prompt if you are on Windows, and then simply navigate to the folder that you want to build your next project in. Then type npx create react app at version number 5, please, and then the name of the app, which is use popcorn. So what? Might that be? That's a bit of a strange name. So let's actually check it out right now. So this is the use popcorn app, and if you want, you can go explore it right now on your own at usepopcorn.netlify.app. So it's called use popcorn because this application is all about movies, and maybe you see that this prefix here of the name is this keyword of use, and that reminds you maybe of the use state name, so the name of the use state book. And that's because we'll build this project over this section and even through other sections, and it's going to be all about books, basically. So that's a hint to that here right in the name. But anyway, here in this search bar, we can now search for movies. Let's say one of my all-time favorite movies called Inception, and this is now loading these movies here from a real API. We're doing some real data fetching here. Then we can click on any of these movies, which will then take us to this display overview. Then we can rate the movie. So you see that we have this nice rating component, and this one is definitely a 10. And it asks us if we want to add the movie to our watchlist, and as we say yes, then you see that the movie has indeed been added to our watchlist here. Let's say we also saw this one here, maybe it was a 7, then let's also add it to our list, and you see now we have both of them, and up here we have some statistics about our watchlist. We can also delete movies from here, so maybe later I remember that I didn't actually watch this one, again with real data fetching. So that's going to be something really nice that we're going to do for the first time. So this app here might feel already a little bit more real in front of that. Now, as I said, we will build this throughout 3 sections, and so in this first section, we'll only work with static data yet. So this list of movies here is not yet coming from the API, it's just an array of objects as we have been working with before. The only thing that works here already is the state here, so we can like collapse these two lists here, and we can also already write something here into this search bar. But besides that, in this section we are more concerned about the component part. So basically creating this layout that we see here, and also talking a bit about component reusability and component composition. With that being said, let's actually move on to the next lecture, where we will learn a bit more about how to think about components. So we're back in the section about thinking in React, which is all about state, data flow, and components. We already talked about state management in detail, and so now it's time to talk more about components. Now, when it comes to components, the important questions that we need to ask ourselves are how do we split up a UI into components, and when should we actually create new components? So let's try to answer these questions in this video. And one way in which we can start answering those questions is by looking at component size. So we can classify every component based on its size, which means that we can place every component on this axis of component size. On one side, we have really small components, and on the other extreme, we have huge components. And many times, none of these extremes are ideal. So imagine that we want to build this simple car. One way of doing it would be to create just one huge component for the entire car. However, that would create a whole set of problems. First, there's way too much stuff going on in this component, so it has way too many responsibilities. So components are just like JavaScript functions, in the sense that if a function does too many different things, we should break it up into multiple functions. And so the same applies to React components. Now, another way in which it becomes apparent that a component is too large is when it needs to receive too many props in order to work properly. So, for example, if we need like 10 or 15 props to properly configure a certain component, that component is probably way too big and should be split up. So, in general, these two problems make it very hard to reuse a component, which is one of the big advantages of components in the first place. Also, huge components generally contain a lot of code that might be complex and intertwined, which ultimately makes the whole component hard to understand and to use. Now, does this mean that we should do the opposite and create many small components like this one? Well, most of the time, that would probably be a terrible idea as well. If we would build a UI for an entire app in this way, we would end up with hundreds, if not thousands, of mini components. This, of course, would create a codebase that is super confusing to navigate and to understand, and it would be way too abstracted. And if you're not familiar with the term abstraction, in programming, it basically means to create something new in order to hide implementation details of that thing. For example, when we create a button component, the user of that component might have no idea how the button actually does what it does, because the implementation details are hidden behind this abstraction, so behind this component. So in a way, each new component that we create is an abstraction. Now, if both ends of the spectrum, so both really small and huge components have these problems, then what should we do? Well, most of the time, the goal is to create components that strike the right balance between being too specific and too broad, or in other words, between being too small and being too big. Now, these problems that we identified here, like components having too many responsibilities and being hard to reuse, can help us understand how we should actually split a UI into components. So, using the same example as before, first we had this with just one huge component, and then we had a lot of small components. And both these ways of splitting up the UI are far from ideal, for all the reasons that we have talked about. So instead, what we want is something like this. So here we have a more logical separation of the content into different components, and some of these components are probably even going to be reusable, like the heart button or the superhost label. Also, each of these components has a well-defined responsibility, like displaying the price or the rating, and they're also not overly complex. Okay, and so from this, we can now derive a couple of criteria that we can use to split a user interface into components. First, when we decide which components we need to implement a certain UI, it's important that these components create a logical separation of the content or even of the layout of a page. We should also strive to make some of these components reusable and ensure that each component has a single, well-defined responsibility. Finally, there's one even more subjective criterion, which is your personal coding style. So some people work better with smaller components, and some people just prefer larger components. And therefore, you need to create components in a way that works best for you, so that you can stay as productive as possible. Alright, but now let's actually dig a bit deeper into all these different criteria. So what I want to do in this slide is to give you something like a framework that will help you create new components from bigger components. So the idea is that when you're creating a new component and you're in doubt about what the component should include, just start with a relatively big component, but not a huge component, and then split that bigger component into smaller components as it becomes necessary. But naturally, you will now ask, when does it actually become necessary to split big components into multiple small ones? Well, that's where the 4 criteria come into play again. So logical separation of content, reusability, the responsibilities and complexity of the component, and your personal coding style. Now, of course, if you already know that you need a small and reusable component such as a button, you can just skip all this and simply create a component. But otherwise, you can just start big and don't need to focus on reusability and complexity at the very beginning. At some point, however, you do need to worry about these topics. And so let's analyze them one by one, starting with logical separation. So if after writing your big component, you feel like the component contains some piece of code or of the layout that don't really belong together, then that means that it's probably a good idea to create a new component. Now, about reusability, if it's possible to reuse a part of your big component, and if you actually want or need to reuse that part, then you should take that code and extract it into a new component. Another sign that you should probably extract part of your component into a new one is that your component is doing way too many different things, or that it's relying on too many props. So if your big component has too many pieces of state or effects, or if the code is way too complex or too confusing, it might be, once again, time to create a new, smaller component. And finally, as I said in the previous slide, it's important that you feel productive when working with your components. So if you prefer smaller functions or components, just split up big components into smaller ones. But on the other hand, if you prefer big components, that's also totally fine. It's all up to you. Because remember, in the end, these are all just guidelines and best practices that will become intuitive over time. And by then, building your components will become second nature to you. But as you start out right now, it's great to have guidelines like these to help you out. And speaking of guidelines, I actually have a few more general guidelines for you. So first off, you need to be aware that creating a new component creates a new abstraction. And we talked about abstractions a bit earlier in this lecture, right? Now, abstractions have a cost, because having more abstractions requires more mental energy to think about different components and to switch back and forth between components. So try not to create new components too early if you can avoid it. Next, it's important that you name a component according to what it does or what it displays. And don't be afraid of using long component names. That's completely normal in React development. Now, what's even more important is that you never ever declare a new component inside another component. And we will learn the reason for that in the next section. What you can do instead when you have some related components is to co-locate these related components inside the same file. Finally, and going back to our initial topic of component size, it's completely normal that an application has components of many different sizes, including some very small ones and some huge ones. So even though we said in the beginning that very small components have some problems, of course we always need some small components like these in any application, because they're highly reusable and have very low complexity, which is sometimes exactly what we need. Most apps will also have a few huge components that are not meant to be reused. For example, we might have a huge page component which contains the layout of the entire app or a page, and that might very well be a fairly complex component which is not meant to be reused. So in situations like this, don't worry about reusability or about needing to split this component up. And speaking of reusability, as you can see from this, we can say that as a general rule, the reusability range is pretty similar to the size range. So generally speaking, the smaller components are, the more reusable they will be. And of course, as components get bigger, they will become less reusable. But again, that's no problem at all for some components. So not all components are meant to be reusable. But anyway, finally, we have all these medium-sized components as well, which all have different degrees of size, reusability, responsibility, and complexity. So in the end, our application will have many different components across the entire spectrum, and that's completely normal and natural. And now let's go back to coding and break up a huge component into many small ones, using all the concepts that we have just learned about. So let's now split one huge component into many small ones using the framework that we just learned about. Now as always, to start, we need to get our starter files here from this folder. So let's grab these two, and then let's move back to our project folder. And as always, I'm renaming it, and then let's paste the new files right in here into the source folder. Then we need to replace these and just get rid of some of this garbage that we have here. Alright, so as always, we just end up with index.js, index.css, and app.js. Then we just grab all this and open it in VS Code as always. Close down this one, and yeah, then we need to clean up this file here. And so this is always a little bit of tedious work, we just have to do it. And actually that's already done. You can take a look here at the CSS if you'd like, because there's actually a lot of it to make this application here work. So to style the application, but what matters most to us is of course this app.js. So here we have this array of objects that I talked about in the previous lecture. Here then we have another array of objects, which is for this watch list. And then here we have that huge component that I was talking about. So it has all this JSX inside. So basically all of this, the entire application is now inside of one component. Proof that you, let's actually start this application here, because this one here is of course still a demo. So let's open up our integrated terminal. That's slightly too big. And then npm start. So let's then open up a new tab in here. And there it is. So make this even smaller. And yeah, so there's the app. And as I was saying in the first lecture, it does work here in terms of collecting these two lists, also writing something here. So all that is working, and it's all working within this one huge component. And so I thought it was a nice exercise to basically pretend that we're working on some team, and that one of our team members created this huge component. Now it's our task to take it and split it up into small components that make it easy to work with, and well, which isn't this huge mess. So let's use the framework that we learned about in the previous lecture to do that. So let's take a look at our JSX here. And if you want, you can of course pause the video and do that on your own, because there's a lot to unpack here. So we have this nav bar here. So this entire thing here is this nav element. Then we have this main part, which is all of this. And inside the nav, we have this box here for this left side, which contains this list. And then we have another box on the right side, which contains all of this. But we will take care of that later. So for now, let's basically split up all of this here into the nav bar and into this main part. So I think to start, that's the best logical separation of the content, which is, remember, the first criteria that we talked about. So those were logical separation of content, second, reusability, third, responsibilities and complexity, and fourth, the personal coding style. So this nav bar here and the main content here, they really don't belong together. So that's a good idea then to create a component for each of them. So code here, and I'll actually now create these components here on top, otherwise I have to scroll too much. So let's write function navbar, and then return simply this. Give it a save, and now it's complaining here. So we now need to also move the state here into this other component. So this one here is depending on query and set query, and so therefore we need to move that state right there. And so actually having all the state here was another great indicator that this component here has way too many responsibilities. So we have 5 pieces of state and then these 3 derived states. So that's way too much. So let's just cut this here, paste that here, and here we also need the movies, but well, for now just replace this here with an X. Okay, so now the navbar is gone because of course we haven't yet included it here. And so let's do that. And now our app looks just like before. So now let's then grab all this other code, all of this, cut it, and put it into yet another component. And this one let's actually call it main. And as we save it, it will now complain that it needs all of these states here. So for now, let's just grab everything and paste that here. Alright. And then, well, we just have to include, of course, that main right here. And then after doing that, the app should look just like before. Well, for some reason it isn't, but let's see that in a minute. For now, I'll just take this component here actually back to the front. To this here. Now let's open up our console. Maybe we have some errors here that we're not catching. But, well, actually no. I think I know. And the reason is that here we are not returning. So we were not returning any JSX, and so then of course we couldn't have any JSX here in the UI. Great, so let's keep going, and let's look again at our navbar. So our navbar is now a lot simpler than before, but it's still doing a lot of different things here, I would say. So we are displaying a logo, we have this input field, and we have the number of results here. Now in a way, all of this does actually belong together because, well, together they form this navbar. So we could definitely argue that this is okay like this. But on the other hand, it still takes some work to actually figure out what this component here is doing. And maybe we even might want to reuse some parts of it. For example, this third bar, or basically this, we might want to reuse it all over the place in the application, at least if the app grew a bit bigger in the future. And so let's at least grab this part here and extract it into its own component. So I'm cutting that. And then let's create a function simply called search. Then return that JSX, and of course we will then need this state, and we will want to include that here. Give it a save, and then it looks exactly like before. Okay? But now something happens here that I personally really don't like, which is to have one piece of JSX which mixes like its native HTML elements with our custom components. So we have this div, we have this p, but then in the middle we have like our own search. So that I think looks really ugly, and I really don't like that. I think it's quite confusing. And so let's actually also extract the logo and the number results. So then we make this component. Now that we have created a few different components, let's quickly talk about different component categories that naturally emerge in most React code bases. So most of your components will naturally fall into one of 3 categories: stateless or presentational components, stateful components, or structural components. And I say naturally because we shouldn't force our components into one of these categories. Now, these are all still normal React components in our code, so just like the ones that we have been writing, but we can categorize them in this way when we think about components. There are also other categories that could be used, but I think that these make the most sense. So, starting with stateless or presentational components, as the name says, these don't have any state. Usually, they are components that receive some props, and then they simply present that data or even some other content, and therefore named presentational. Many times, these are quite small components, such as the logo, num results, and movie components in our current app. Next, stateful components are simply components that do have state. Now, just because these components have state, that doesn't mean that they can't be highly reusable. For example, the search component that we built does have state, and we could reuse this input as many times as we wanted throughout the app. Now, finally, you can think of structural components as pages, layouts, or screens of the application, which are oftentimes the result of composing many smaller components together. And more about composition later in this section. So, these structural components can be large and non-reusable components, but they don't have to. Structural components are sometimes quite small too. What matters is that they are responsible for providing some sort of structure to applications, such as pages or layouts. Therefore, these components might not be present in really small apps, but you will definitely have a few structural components as your app grows bigger and bigger. Now, we left a small problem in one of the components that we just created earlier, and so let's now go fix that problem and in the process discover the problem of prop drawing. But before we go do that, I just want to very quickly review the previous lecture by classifying each of our components into one of the categories that we just looked at. So I think that clearly both the app and the navbar component here are structural components, so they are only responsible for the structure or for the layout of the application. And the same can also be said of this main component here. So those are for providing structure. Then the logo here is clearly a presentational component, so it doesn't have any state, so therefore it's stateless, and it simply presents some content here. Then the search is of course a stateful component, and num-results is just a presentational component here, maybe we already talked about. Then we have the list box, which clearly is a stateful component. And the same for the movie list and for the what box. So those are all stateful components, while the movie simply receives this prop right here and then presents that data in the user interface. So movie here is just a stateless or presentational component. Then we have this one here, which is also a presentational component, and the same for this one, so watch movies list and watch movie. Alright, and that's actually it. I just wanted to quickly categorize each of them. But now let's move on to that problem that I mentioned in the very beginning. And that is that right now, here we are not dynamically calculating the number of results. So we are not basically taking the list of movies and reading how many there are and then displaying it here. That's what we want to do. But yeah, now we only have this X. So what we need basically is to get access to the movies state right here in num results. Now, where does that state live right now? Well, it's here, inside of movies list. So, right here. So, again, it's here, but we also need it here in non-results. So, what's the solution to that? And I really hope you already know at this point. Well, the solution is to lift the state up to the closest parent component. And what parent is that? Well, it's the app component, right? So it's not an F bar, because of course that's not the parent of movie list, and so it is really the app component. So what we need to do is to cut this from here and place it right back into the app component. Alright, and now we need to pass it down as a prop to where we need it. And so this is where the problem of prop drilling will come into play. So again, we need now this state in order to make this work again inside of the movie list. But this movie list is really deeply nested inside this component tree, right? So it has these two parent components, which now will also need to receive that state as a prop. But instead of talking, let's actually do this. So movies equals movies. So now we have the movies array inside main. So let's go there, and we need to receive it here. And then we need to pass it here right into the watch box, right into the list box. So movies equal movies. Actually here that's not main, of course, it's movies. Okay, so now we got it inside the main, and now we got it inside the list box. So let's come here and do it all again. So accepting it here, and then passing it here. Movies equal movies. And so what we are doing right now is what we call prop drilling. So now we finally accept it here, and then it works again. So basically prop drilling means that we need to pass some prop through several nested child components in order to get that data into some deeply nested component, which in this case is this one. So we have to pass this movies prop here first into the main, then from the main into the list box, and then from the list box into the movie list. And so all these components, they didn't actually even need this prop. All they needed this for was then pass it down even further the tree. And so we end up with a lot of props that are really not needed at all. All they are needed for is to pass the data down even further into our component tree. So this is what prop drilling is, and you saw that it is not a lot of fun, and could be even worse, of course, if the data was nested even deeper into the tree. This was just like 3 levels deep, but so this is what prop drilling is, and you saw that it is not a lot of fun, and it could be even worse, of course, if the data was nested even deeper into the tree. This was just like 3 levels deep, but it could be like 5 or 10 levels, and then it would become a little bit out of control. So we will look at ways of fixing prop drilling a bit later in the section, but for now, let's finally also make this prop. So this movies data available right here where we also need it. So right here, so movies equal movies, but now we have to do some prop drilling again, because here we need to again accept this prop, but we don't need it here. Oh. As we keep learning about components in this section, there is one essential principle that we really need to focus on now, which is component composition. Now, in order to talk about component composition, we first need to take a look at what happens when we simply use or include a component in another component in JSX. So let's say that we have this modal component that we want to reuse, and also this success component, which simply renders the message well done. And then we just use the success component inside the modal component like this. And this sort of thing is exactly what we have been doing with our components most of the time, right? So just use them inside of other components. However, when it comes to reusability, this creates a big problem. That's because right now, the success component really is inside of modal. They are deeply linked together in the JSX right now, and therefore we cannot reuse this modal component to display some other message inside of it, for example, an error message. But as you can imagine, in order to solve this, we now bring in the technique of component composition, where we can compose the modal and success components together. So here we have our modal component again, so now, which is component composition. Now, in order to talk about component composition, we first need to take a look at what happens when we simply use or include a component in another component in JSX. So let's say that we have this modal component that we want to reuse, and also this success component, which simply renders the message well done. And then we just use the success component inside the modal component like this. And this sort of thing just include a component in another component in JSX. So let's say that we have this modal component that we want to reuse, and also this success component, which simply renders the message well done. And then we just use the success component inside the modal component like this. And this sort of thing is exactly what we have been doing with our components most of the time, right? So just use them inside of other components. However, when it comes to reusability, this creates a big problem. That's because right now, the success component really is inside of modal. They are deeply linked together in the JSX right now, and therefore we cannot reuse this modal component to display some other message inside of it, for example, an error message. But as you can imagine, in order to solve this, we now bring in the technique of component composition, where we can compose the modal and success components together. So here we have our modal component again, but with a fundamental difference. So this component does not include a predefined component. but instead it accepts children with the children prop. So just like we have learned before. So if we get our success component again, we can now basically just pass it into the model by placing it between the opening and closing tags when we use modal. And if you need a minute to analyze this code a bit better, feel free to just pause the video right now, because I want you to really grasp the fundamental difference here. So in the first example, the success component is really tied to the model, and so that model might as well be called a success model, because we can't use it for anything else anymore. But with component composition, we simply pass the success component right into the model and compose them together in this way. And this sort of thing is exactly what we have developed as another component in JSX. So let's say that we have this modal component that we want to reuse, and also this success component, which simply renders the message well done. And then we just use the success component inside modal components like this. And this sort of thing is exactly what we have been doing with our components most of the time, right? So just use them inside of other components. However, when it comes to reusability, this creates a big problem. That's because right now, the success component really is inside of modal. They are deeply linked together in the JSX right now. And therefore, we cannot reuse this modal component to display some other message inside of it. For example, an error message. But as you can imagine, in order to solve this, we now bring in the technique of component composition, where we can compose the modal and success components together. So here we have our modal component again, but with a fundamental difference. So this component does not include a predefined component. But instead, it accepts children with the children prop. So just like we have learned before. So if we get our success component again, we can now basically just pass it into the modal by placing it between the opening and closing tags when we use modal. And if we need to analyze this code a bit better, feel free to just pause the video right now, because I want you to really grasp the fundamental difference here. So in the first example, the success component is really tied to the model, and so that model might as well be called a success model, because we can't use it for anything else anymore. But with component composition, we simply pass the success component right into the model and compose them together in this way. And again, this works thanks to the children problem. Now of course, we could have passed in any other component, which makes the model component highly reusable. So essentially, when we do component composition, we leave this hole or this empty slot in the component, ready to be filled with any other component that we want. So let's say that later we need another model window somewhere else in the app, but one that renders this error message. Well, that's pretty easy now. We just use the model component again, but this time we pass in the error component as a children. And with this, we have also successfully composed these two components together as well. So formally, component composition is the technique of combining different components by using the children prop or by explicitly defining components as props. Now, we use composition for two big reasons, or in two important situations. First, when we want to create highly reusable and flexible components, such as the model window, or really a million other reusable components that we can think of. And we do this really all the time. Now, the second situation in which we can use composition is in order to fix a prop drilling problem, like the one that we found in the previous video. And this is actually great for creating layouts, as we will do in the next video. Just keep in mind, once again, that this is only possible because components do not need to know their children in advance, which allows us to leave these empty slots inside of them in the form of the children prop. And with that being said, let's return to our project. So let's now use component composition in order to fix the prop drilling problem that we have just encountered before. And in the process, you'll also find a way better solution to building layouts in React applications. And let's start by fixing the easy prop drilling problem, which is the one where we pass the movies prop into the navbar, and then from the navbar, we pass it here into the num results. So here we only have one level of prop drilling. Now, you might be wondering, how can we use component composition in order to solve this problem? Well, what if we could use the num result component right here in the app component instead of in the navbar? Then we wouldn't have to pass in this movies prop into the navbar, right? Which would then fix that prop drilling problem. Well, if the num has to move to build account, use component composition in order to fix the prop drilling problem that we have just encountered before. And in the process, you'll also find a way better solution to building layouts in React applications. And let's start by fixing the easy prop drilling problem, which is the one where we pass the movies prop into the navbar, and then from the navbar, we pass it here into the num results. So here we only have one level of prop drilling. Now, you might be wondering, how can we use component composition in order to solve this problem? Well, what if we could use the num result component right here in the app component instead of in the navbar, then we wouldn't have to pass in this movies prop into the navbar, right? Which would then fix that prop drilling problem. So we can actually do that with component composition. So let me show you how. So here instead of accepting the movies, let's accept children. And so this is then that empty slot that we talked about in the previous lecture. And so now here in the navbar, instead of closing it right here, let's have an opening tag and a closing tag. And then between these two, we can just grab this, place that here, and then just include those children. And that's it, actually. So give it a save. The app looks exactly the same as before, but we have eliminated the prop drilling problem, right? Because now we are using num results right here in the component where the state actually lives. So the movies state in this case. And so then we can pass it directly into the component right here, which is the one that actually needs it. So num results is not an intermediary component, just like navbar was before. And so, of course, then here we can finally and terminally remove it. And so this then really shows that the prop drilling has been eliminated. Would then fix that prop drilling problem to the 9th. Well, 50 num results. So here we only have one level of prop drilling applications. And let's start by fixing the easy prop drilling problem, which is the one where we pass the movies prop into the navbar, and then from the navbar, we pass it here into the num results. So here we only have one level of prop drilling. Now, you might be wondering, how can we use component composition in order to solve this problem? Well, what if we could use the num result component right here in the app component instead of in the navbar? Then we wouldn't have to pass in this this movies prop into the navbar, right? Which would then fix that prop drilling problem. So we can actually do that with component composition. So let me show you how. So here, instead of accepting the movies, let's accept children. And so this is then that empty slot that we talked about in the previous lecture. And so now here in the navbar, instead of closing it right here, let's have an opening tag and a closing tag. And then between these two, we can just grab this, place that here, and then just include those children. And that's it, actually. So give it a save. The app looks exactly the same as before, but we have eliminated the prop drilling problem, right? Because now we are using num_results right here in the component where the state actually lives. So the movies state in this case. And so then we can pass it directly into the component right here, which is the one that actually needs it. So num_results is not an intermediary component, just like navbar was before. And so of course then here we can finally and terminally remove it. And so this then really shows that the prop drilling has been eliminated, and all by using component composition, where we now basically compose the navbar together with these three other components here. So these three is what are becoming the children of the navbar. And so here, again, we then accept those children and simply display them here. We could also say, for example, that we do not need to display or to include the logo right here. So we could, for example, cut it here and place it here. And then it works just exactly the same as before. So this logo here is just completely stateless anyway, and it's not really relevant to the app. And so we could say that it should always be a part of the navbar. But maybe these two here can be optional. So with this, we can very easily later say that, well, maybe we don't need a search here. So remove it, and there you go. We didn't even have to touch the navbar at all. All we had to do was to come into our application, where we now have an easier way of seeing basically the overall layout of the application. Let's of course put it back, and then let's fix the worst problem of prop drilling that we also have, which is here for this movies list. So let's do the same with the main component here. And here remember that we actually need to pass the movies prop through several layers. So we pass it from app into main into here the list box. And so we can remove, again, all these intermediary steps. So here in the main, let's no longer accept the movies, and instead accept children. So then let's remove the watch box from here, or actually the list box, or actually why not both of them. So let's cut them from here, say children, and then we can do the same thing as before. So here now we get rid of this. Let's close it. And then just place these two here, and we can then no longer pass the movies into the main element, or the main component, because that one no longer needs it. I mean, as you know, it never even needed it in the first place. It only needed it to pass it further down the tree. But now the tree is basically built in a different way. And so then, again, this component no longer needs that prop. Nice. And so, actually, we can keep going. So we can just do exactly the same thing here to the list box, because that list box also doesn't need the movies, really. It's also just passing it down. And so, let's remove it. So, let's grab this, cut it from here. So this will now become the empty slot here inside this list box component. So, remove that. Do the same thing as before. Of course, we need to close it here. And, well, that's taking a bit too long. Let's manually reload here. And still, that's not working. But the code should be correct. Let me just remove this from here now. And I will simply close the app and run it again. So it's the second time we needed to do this in this section so far, but sometimes that can happen. Well, apparently this is not the solution this time, so let's see if we have some error here. And actually, yeah, sometimes it's a good idea, as I said right in the beginning of the course, to actually read the errors here. So it says objects are not valid as a React child. So let's go back to our movie list, or to the list box, actually, which is the one that we just did something in. And yeah, the problem is actually right here. So here we were basically creating a new object, which is not necessary. All we need to do here is to really conditionally render this children prop. Give it a save, and there we go. Just reload again to get rid of the errors, and that's it. So now an object as a React child. So let's go back to our movie list, or to the list box, actually, which is the one that we just did something in. And yeah, the problem is actually right here. So here we were basically creating a new object, which is not necessary. All we need to do here is to really conditionally render this children prop. Give it a save, and there we go. Just reload again to get rid of the errors, and that's it. So now we are essentially directly passing the movies prop right here into the movies list from the app component. So as I just said, we are in the app component, and now, thanks to all this composition here, we can pass the movies directly into the movies list, which is in fact the only component that does actually need it. Not this one, but only this one. And of course, also this one. Great. So this is actually a really, really nice way of building layouts in React applications. So just by looking at the return JSX from the app component, we can nicely see the entire layout and also basically the entire component tree. So what we have here is indeed very similar to what we can observe right here. So we have the app, which has the navbar, which in turn has the search and num_results, and we have the main, which has the list box, it has the watch box, and then that one also has some stuff in it. So here we didn't do the component composition yet, but we will do very soon. For now, I want to take a break here, and I want you to analyze this code on your own for a few minutes. So really understand the deep difference between the code that we had before and the code that we have right now. And if necessary, you can also rewatch the previous lecture in which I explained exactly what is happening as well. So we use composition in order to solve a prop building problem and to build our layout in a way nicer way. And so now let's use it to build a reusable box component. So we already converted the list box component here to use the children prop in order to then basically fill that slot, so that hole, with this component that we pass in as a child component. And so now we could go ahead and do the exact same thing with the watch box. So let's actually go there. So watch box, and it's right here. However, if you take a look at this component right here, it is very, very similar to that other box, so to that list box. So basically both of them have this state here of is open. In the lecture about component composition, I said that we can use the children prop for composition or an explicitly defined prop. And so let's now quickly explore that second option. So instead of using the children prop in a component and then passing in a component like this, we can use an explicit prop as an alternative. So let me show you what I mean by first commenting out all of this, and then we can go to the box component. So down here, and now instead of accepting children here, let's say we accept something called element. And it can really be called anything, so just L or really whatever. So now we can go back up here and include the box in the old way. So closing it immediately, but then we can specify the element prop. And now here, we can then do exactly what we had here. So let's copy that and paste it, give it a save, and that worked. So now we have our movie list like here, and it was passed into the box component as an explicit prop. In this case, a prop called element. So before, what we had here is that we were basically implicitly passing in this component into the box, and then we read it there with the children prop. But here, we now basically pass it in more explicitly. So we really say that we have an element prop, and then we place whatever we want to pass in right here. So right into the element prop. And this pattern is used in some library, for example, in React Router. And so this is why I thought it might be interesting to show this to you right now. And of course, we can do the same with the... Instead of using the children prop in a component, and then passing in a component like this, we can use an explicit prop as an alternative. So let me show you what I mean by first commenting out all of this, and then we can go to the box component. So down here, and now instead of accepting children here, let's say we accept something called element. And it can really be called anything, so just L or really whatever. So now we can go back up here and include the box in the old way. So closing it immediately, but then we can specify the element. And now here, we can then do exactly what we had here. So let's copy that and paste it. Give it a save, and that worked. So now we have our movie list like here, and it was passed into the box component as an explicit prop. In this case, a prop called element. So before, what we had here is that we were basically implicitly passing in this component into the box, and then we read it there with the children prop. But here, we now basically pass it in more explicitly. So we really say that we have an element prop, and then we place whatever we want to pass in right here. So right into the element prop. And this pattern is used in some library, for example, in React Router. And so this is why I thought it might be interesting to show this to you right now. And of course, we can do the same with the other box here. So simply saying element, and then this. Now here, basically, we are passing in a brand new piece of JSX. So here, we now actually need a fragment. Give it a save, and there we go. So the app now looks exactly the same as before, but we basically passed in an element, or multiple elements here, instead of using the children prop. But the result is exactly the same. And under the hood, inside React, it should also be basically exactly the same. So this can be a viable pattern in case you need to pass in multiple elements and give them separate names. So that would be a perfectly fine use case for using something like an element prop, or really any other prop with any other name, instead of the implicit children prop. But in our case, let's go back to what we had before, because I think it looks a lot nicer actually, and it's also clearly the preferred way of doing this inside React. So this was really just to show you. So I will just delete this entire code and put this one here back, and then let's go to the box and fix it there as well. And by the way, let me show you a very nice trick in VS Code, which is that if you hover over any component here and then hit Command on the Mac or Control on Windows, we can actually go right to the definition of the function. So in this case, of the component. So I'm hovering box here, then I hit the Command key, click, and then I immediately move there. And what's even nicer is that if we do the same down here, so again, hitting the Command or the Control key, then we go right back up. Well, in this case, somehow it doesn't work, but usually it should. But yeah, what matters is that we can move from where the component is called into the place where it is actually defined. So now let's change element back to children, and then we have just what we had before. So this was really just to show you an alternative way of using component composition without the children prop. But again, using children is by far the preferred way of doing things. Let's now take a break from building our project and build a small, reusable, and flexible star rating component. So what we want to build is a component like this one. So it displays multiple stars, and then as we hover over them, it displays the currently selected rating here on the right side. So as you see, as we hover over the stars, it always shows the currently selected number of stars, and if we click here, then that number stays fixed. And if we then click again, because this movie is definitely a 10, then of course we can also change that rating. Okay, now we will develop this component here in complete isolation, so outside of this current application, so that we could reuse it anywhere we wanted, and also make it really flexible by allowing for different prompts. For example, here we can rate between 0 and 10 right now, but we will make it so that the user of the component can choose what number of stars they want to display. And that's just one of the things that we will do. But anyway, let's now come here to our project, and then let's create a brand new component file here. So star rating, and then export default function, and then the name of the component. So star rating. And for now we won't accept any props here, we will leave that for later. And now let's just return something here. And now what I want to do is to actually come to the index.js file, and then no longer import the app here for now, and also not the CSS file. Because again, this component should be completely reusable, and so it shouldn't depend on any external CSS files. So instead, what I want to do now is to import that star rating. And you see that VS Code automatically wrote our import statement here. And if for some reason your VS Code didn't help you with this autocomplete, then just make sure to type exactly this. Then finally, we also need to remove this one here temporarily, and instead include our star rating here. And I'm doing it like this just so that we don't have to create a brand new project just for building this one component. So for now we will just use this project that we already have instead of creating a new Create React app. But anyway, let's give it a save now. And now here you see that component file here. So star rating, and then export default function, and then the name of the component. So star rating. And for now we won't accept any props here, we will leave that for later. And now let's just return something here. And now what I want to do is to actually come to the index.js file, and then no longer import the app here for now, and also not the CSS file. Because again, this component should be completely reusable, and so it shouldn't depend on any external CSS files. So instead, what I want to do now is to import that star rating. And you see that VS Code automatically wrote our import statement here. And if for some reason your VS Code didn't help you with this autocomplete, then just make sure to type exactly this. Then finally, we also need to remove this one here temporarily, and instead include our star rating here. And I'm doing it like this just so that we don't have to create a brand new project just for building this one component. So for now we will just use this project that we already have instead of creating a new Create React app. But anyway, let's give it a save now. And now here you see that hello that's coming from here, so from the star rating. So let's close the app and this sidebar, and then let's get started. So starting with the JSX here, so just with the structure, we see that we have basically two main elements. So we have one container for all these stars, and we have then like this message here, so the current rating on the right side. So inside our div, let's place another div for those stars, and then one paragraph for that message. So for now, let me just place a number here, and here for the stars, we want to dynamically generate these star elements. So instead of writing them by hand one by one, because that's the only way in which we could sometimes have 5 stars, in other situations 10 stars, or really any other number. So let's use a technique that we used before in the far away app. So entering JavaScript mode, and then we can write array.from, and here we can then specify an object with a length property, and let's set it here to 5 initially. And so this then creates an empty array with 5 elements that we can then immediately loop over by passing in a function, so like the map function here as the second argument. So in this function, we are not interested in the elements themselves. Let's just use a placeholder variable, but we are interested here in the number. Alright, and now here we can just render anything. Let's just do a span element for now, but later we will place the stars in here. So let's just write s for star, and then here the number. And actually this should be s plus 1, because I of course is 0 based here. Okay, and this should already be something. And indeed we see star 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which of course again are just placeholders for now. Here we have some error, which probably, yeah, just because of that key prompt. So let's add that key here. Well, actually we don't, because this is just temporary anyway. Okay, so now let's define some styles here. And remember how I said initially that we cannot depend on any external CSS file or CSS classes. And therefore, we need to define all our styles inline. So let's do that, starting here with the parent element. And so here we now need to specify an object. And why not actually do that here as a separate object outside? So let's write container style. And let's set the display property to flex. So to place the two elements side by side. Then align items. Let's set that one to center, which will align the items vertically. And then let's also specify a gap of 16 pixels. Okay, and now here we can just specify that. Give it a save, and that looks already a bit better. And now we can do even better, which is to take this entire object, which will never change, and it doesn't depend on anything that is here in the component, and we can place it completely outside of the component. And by doing so, this object here will not have to be regenerated by JavaScript each time that this component here re-renders. Because otherwise, each time that the component does re-render, this function will get called again, and so then this object will also get regenerated again. And so that's not necessary, and so we can just place it outside here. Now next, let's also create some styles for the other container, so this container here with the stars. So let's say star container style. So let's also do display flex, and then give it a gap here of just 4 pixels for now. Alright. And finally just some styling here for the text. So text style, let's say line height. Yeah, I was trying to write some actual CSS, but in JSX, remember, we need to write our property names camel case. So not line dash height, but line height like this. let's also specify a margin of 0. And here let's actually say 1. So this probably won't change a lot yet, but it's going to be important later. So style. Okay, and now to finish, let's do what I said right in the very beginning, which is to basically allow the user of this component to set the maximum amount of stars, so the maximum rating. So coming back here, let's say that as the user of this component, I wanted to pass in the max rating, for example, as 5. And then maybe I wanted to use this component at some other place in my application, but here I wanted 10 stars. But now as we reload, of course, both of these components will only have 5 stars, because we hard-coded that value here in our rating. So what we need to do is to now accept that prop here, max rating, and then use that right here. And so this is why we had to use this trick here instead of manually writing the number of stars. So instead of writing one element here per star. And so if I save this now, you see that indeed we get now 10 stars here. Great. But now, what if someone used this component without specifying the max rating property? So since we're building a highly reusable component, we need to account for all these situations, because we will never know who is actually going to use this component and what props they will specify. So we need to account that this might happen. So in this case, we have a problem, because then, well, we have exactly no stars. So what we need to do is to set a default value for the rating. So how do we do that? Well, we can actually leverage the power of destructuring in JavaScript, because whenever we destructure an object, we can actually set a default value as we do so. And so here we are actually destructuring the props object. And so if max rating doesn't exist, we can set a default simply by writing this. And so if we save this now, then we are back to having our 5 stars by default. And so this is a very common way of setting default props in React applications. We will do this all the time as we go through the course. Next up, let's actually create the stars and make the component dynamic by reacting to a click event. So let's create a brand new component here. So function star, because the JSX code here is actually going to be a bit complex. When we build a reusable component like the one we are currently building, we should carefully think about what props the component needs. So let's now shortly look at how to think about props. So first of all, as we start working on our components, we should get into the mindset that any component is always created by someone and always consumed by someone. Now, when you're working on your own, the component creator and consumer is of course the same person. But if you're on a team, those might very well be different developers. developers. But in any case, it's always a good idea to think in terms of there being a creator and a consumer of a component. So different entities, even if it's just yourself. So basically, the creator is the person building a component and defining what props the component can accept, while the consumer uses the component somewhere in the application by specifying values for the props. Now, the reason for the separation between creator and consumer, even if you're just working on your own, is that if we have this mindset, we can think of the component's props as the public API of the component. So as a component creator, when we choose what props the consumer is about what props the component needs. So let's now shortly look at how to think about props. So first of all, as we start working on our components, we should get into the mindset that any component is always created by someone and always consumed by someone. Now, when you're working on your own, the component creator and consumer is of course the same person. But if you're on a team, those might very well be different developers. But in any case, it's always a good idea to think in terms of there being a creator and a consumer of a component. So different entities, even if it's just yourself. So basically, the creator is the person building a component and defining what props the component can accept, while the consumer uses the component somewhere in the application by specifying values for the props. Now, the reason for the separation between creator and consumer, even if you're just working on your own, is that if we have this mindset, we can think of the component's props as the public API of the component. So as a component creator, when we choose what props the consumer is allowed to pass in, we are essentially defining the public interface of our component. And at the same time, we are choosing how much complexity of the component we want to expose to the consumer of the API. Because in the end, a component is basically just an abstraction. So we are encapsulating a part of the UI and the associated logic into a component and allow consumers to interact with that component via props. And that's it. That's basically what creating a new component is. But anyway, when we decide about what props to allow in a component, we need to find a good balance on how strict we want to be. So about how many props we want to enable for, well, be different developers, and always consumed by someone about props. So first of all, as we start working on our components, we should get into the mindset that any component is always created by someone and always consumed by someone. Now, when you're working on your own, the component creator and consumer is of course the same person. But if you're on a team, those might very well be different developers. But in any case, it's always a good idea to think in terms of there being a creator and a consumer of a component. So different entities, even if it's just yourself. So basically, the creator is the person building a component and defining what props the component can accept, while the consumer uses the component somewhere in the application by specifying values for the props. Now, the reason for the separation between creator and consumer, even if you're just working on your own, is that if we have this mindset, we can think of the component's props as the public API of the component. So as a component creator, when we choose what props the consumer is allowed to pass in, we are essentially defining the public interface of our component. And at the same time, we are choosing how much complexity of the component we want to expose to the consumer of the API. Because in the end, the component is basically just an abstraction. So we are encapsulating a part of the UI and the associated logic into a component and allow consumers to interact with that component via props. And that's it. That's basically what creating a new component is. But anyway, when we decide about what props to allow in a component, we need to find a good balance on how strict we want to be. So about how many props we want to enable for configuration. For example, let's say we're building a weather component. So a component that simply displays the weather. We could make it extremely simple, for example, only allowing one prop, so for the location for which the consumer wants the weather. Now, this might be perfectly fine, but it might also make the component not flexible enough, or maybe even straight out useless for the consumer. On the other hand, we could allow props for the URL of the weather data, the number of days, whether it should be daily or hourly, how many days, which temperature the unit, what data should be displayed, and so on. I could think of really 20 other props here, but the point is that exposing so many props might make the component way too hard to use for the consumer because we're exposing too much complexity. And speaking of complexity, you'll end up with very complex code if you want to allow so many props. So when deciding on the right API for your components, try to strike the right balance between too little and too many props, and a balance that works well for both the creator and the consumer of the component based on the project's needs. Now, if for some reason you really need to expose so many props, make sure to at least provide some good default values for many of them. Okay, and as always, this will come to you with practice, but I thought that it was quite important to get you into this mindset of distinguishing between component creators and consumers. And so with that, we're ready to put this into practice. Okay, so let's now make our component really flexible and reusable by defining a nice public API for consumers to use it. So right now, our component is quite unflexible and therefore not really reusable. So it might maybe be useful in one very specific case where we want the component to look and behave exactly like this, but it won't be useful for many other consumers. So if we imagine that we want to reuse this component in many other applications, or maybe even publish it to NPM to share it with all React developers around the world, then they will probably not find this component very useful right now. So those developers, or in other words, those consumers, they will probably want to define things like the colors of the stars, or maybe the sizes of the stars and the text, in order to basically make this component fit into their own applications. And so what we're going to do now is to try to define a good public API for this component, just as we learned before. And so by doing that, we will try to find that balance of using too few props and using too little props, so that the component also doesn't get way too complex. So let's get to work, and let's actually start with those two simple things that I just mentioned. So the color and the size. So let's just write it here, color and size. And as I mentioned also in the last lecture, it's a good idea to provide default values. So we've already learned that we can do that by providing the default values during the structuring, so just like we did with the max rating. And so let's say that our default color will be this yellow of FCC419. And the default size, let's make it the number of 48. Okay, and now let's use these props in our component. So to basically accept the color, we then change the stars and the text to fit that color. And the same for the size. So we want to start with the text, and so now I actually need to take this object here back into the component, because now we will specify some properties which will depend on the props. And so the props are of course only accessible inside the component, and then this object will have to live inside the component as well. So the color property will be set to color, and so we can actually just do it like this, and if we get this to save, then you see the text does indeed turn yellow. Now it might be a bit small, and so let's now also use the size. And so let's use a template literal, and then use the size that we received as a prop, and set the pixels to that. Well, that's maybe a bit too large. Let's try to divide this, for example, by 1.5, and that looks a bit nicer. Alright, and now we should also use these values here, of course, for the stars themselves. So to do that, we will also now place this style object inside the star, and then we need these values also here. So the color and the size, and so of course then we need to pass them in here as well. So color, and size, and size. And then here we can, again, create a template literal, get the size, and then pixels. Let's do the same for the height. And here nothing changed, because we already had 48 here. And now finally the color is actually defined right in the SVG elements. So here we have the fill and the stroke of black, which is the reason why these are currently black. But if we change that here, like this, so color, and you see that it just turned yellow. Now of course this other one isn't yellow yet because, well, it's still at black. Let's change that to this one. Okay, beautiful. So that's already a lot nicer than before. Let's just call another component here. And let's define some other size here. Let's say 24. Here we have a much smaller component, but which still works in the same way. And of course we can also specify the color, let's say red. And so with this, we just made our component a lot more flexible. So if someone wants to use this component in an application where the main color is red, then they can now easily change all of this to red. Now sometimes consumers or users of the component want to have even more control over the styling. So sometimes it's a good idea to allow users to pass in a class name. For example, class name with the name of test, just in this case, which will then come from some CSS file in the application where this component is being used. So right now we don't have any class like this, but this is just really for testing purposes. So then here we need to accept the class name. And by default we'll just be the class name, and then we just add here to the overall container. So class name, and then class name like this. So for example, if the user wants to somehow change the font style, they can do that right inside this class name that they pass in, and so that class name will then be added here, and will then change the font family of our component. Now another thing that I sometimes see on the web when we have a component like this is that instead of just displaying the rating number, is that they display like some message according to the rating. So in order to do that, we could pass in an array, and let's actually do that here. So we could pass in an array of messages, for example, saying that the first value is terrible, the second one is bad, then we have okay, good, well, a string, and then amazing. And so now we can display these 5 values here, so these strings instead of the numbers. So that's another nice touch that we can give our component here. So then we set that prop here, and by default, let's make it an empty array. So really, really important to always give default values. And so now here we can use those values. However, we want of course to only use that messages array in case there actually are some elements in it. And also the number of elements should be correct. So for example, if we allow for a rating between 1 and 5, but then we only have 3 elements in the array, then that doesn't make a lot of sense. So this wouldn't work. And so here what we can do is to just check if messages.length is equal to the max rating. And if that is the case, then it means that the messages array was passed in. And if not, then we just do exactly what we had before. But in this case, let's then just display the messages at position rating -1 in order to convert back to 0-based index. And of course we should also consider the temporary rating. So let's actually just copy what we have here, or maybe not. Okay, that's not that similar. So let's come here and say if there is a temp rating, then use temp rating -1, and if not, then just use the regular rating -1. So again, this looks confusing, then just make sure to pause the video and analyze that code. But this is just normal JavaScript at this point. But anyway, as you see, this works great now. So 1 star means terrible, bad, and it starts to become okay, good, and finally amazing. And of course it also works with the not temporary rating, with the fixed rating. While here this other component where the messages array is empty. So that's the default here. So here it's empty, and so therefore we are still displaying just the number. Great. And let's keep going, because there's still at least one important thing missing, and that is to allow the consumer to set a default rating. Okay, so that's not very hard. So let's say, for example, that the user wants to start with a default of 3. Default rating should be 3. So the consumer might want to specify a prop like this. So let's now then add that prop here and give it a default value. Now by default, the rating should be 0. To finish this component, let's now add type checking to the component props using prop types. So with prop types, we can basically specify the type of value that we expect the consumer of the component to pass in for each of the props. For example, we can define that this max rating here really must be a number and nothing else. And this is what we call type checking. So again, checking each type of the prop and specifying what type they need to have. Now, if you really care about this, you should actually just use TypeScript instead of JavaScript. Now, I'll show you how to use React's built-in prop types because it actually does make a lot of sense for this reusable component, but I will not do this in the rest of the course for all components that we're going to build because that just takes too much time, and also developers these days don't really do this anymore. Again, if this is really important for your app, you can just use TypeScript instead of JavaScript, which is what many teams and many developers started doing, again, instead of using prop types. But anyway, let's now actually use prop types, and for that, we import the prop types object from the prop types package. So there's no need to install this prop type package here in this case because Create React App already comes with this package pre-installed. But we do need to import it here, so just as we did here, because it is actually a separate package from React itself. Okay, and now in order to do the type checking, let's use our component, let's start rating, and then on this component we specify the prop types property. And here it's important that we write it with a lowercase. So prop types, and then here we then assign those prop types an object. So again, we imported prop types here with a capital P, but the property name here is with this lowercase p. Okay, and now here for each of the props we can specify type. So let's say max rating, and so that's exactly the name of the prop that we have here. And then now we actually use that prop type object that we imported in the very beginning. And so now all we need to do is use one of the validators that is inside this object. So here we can simply say prop types dot number, and that's it. So let's say that here we import this star rating, and instead of specifying a number, we specify a string. And so then here we get this problem, or this warning here, which has invalid prop of max rating, and that's because it has a type of string instead of the expected number. And it's these warnings right here that will then allow other developers to catch bugs like this, because I mean no one would specify this here on purpose, but by mistake we might end up here with a string. For example, also this could happen. So we could specify the 5 here, but as a string, and then you will still get the same problem. Now the code does actually work with this here somehow, so JavaScript is somehow able to coerce the type into a number, but again, here we get this warning because we really should specify this not as a string, but as a number. So then of course this disappears. Now we can also change the is to required property here, which just as the name says, will then make this prop required. So somewhere here we probably have one without, yeah, this one doesn't have the max rating, and then immediately we get this warning down here. Alright, but in our case we actually have some default values for all of our props already defined, and so it doesn't make sense then to mark any of them as required. So by default you shouldn't use this one. So instead just use default values for all or most of your props. But anyway, now let's keep going and let's make this really complete. So the default rating should also be a number, and the color should be a string, and so we basically have one of these validators here for all types that you can imagine. So this one is also a number. Then we have the messages, and so here we have prop types.array. Let's see what else we have. So we also have the class name, which is a string. So here I wrote the wrong one, so always use the uppercase prop types. And now finally the on set rating prop. The prop type, and this one is a func, which stands for function. Okay, and besides these two, we also have .bool, which stands for a boolean, so it's a true or false value, and we also have offset. So in this case, we have none of these, and so this one is just a function. Okay, and that's actually all that we have to do. And as you see here, adding prop types is also a nice way of documenting our components, because this type definition right here makes it really obvious what kind of data we are expecting. But as I said in the very beginning, I will not start using this in all components from now on. So this was mostly just to show you that you can use this yourself in case that you have some component like this, which you want to make highly reusable across multiple applications, or even just inside one application, and if at the same time you don't want to switch to TypeScript. But in any case, with this, we finished our reusable components, and we also reached the end of this section. All we have left to do is one final coding challenge to practice what we just learned here in this section. Welcome to another coding challenge, and I hope that you really are finding these useful. And if you do, then it's now time to build a reusable text expander component. So here I have 3 of these text expander components that we are going to build. So text expander is basically when we have some parts of a text, and then we have this kind of button here that when we click it will reveal the entirety of the text. And then when we click it again, it will go back to hiding it. This one here is basically one of the text expander components, and then here we have another one. And immediately you see that this one has by default a lot more text, and then this button here has some different text than this one, and also different color. But then when we click it, the behavior is exactly the same. Then finally we have another one, and you see that this one has some different styling, and also by default it is open. So then when we click here, it will close. So let's go here to the starter code, which as always I have attached as a link to this lecture. And if for some reason you don't want to build this challenge here on Code Sandbox, just copy paste the code from here and also from the CSS file. That's not a lot, but we will still need it. Alright, so here I already have the 3 components included inside the app, and the component itself right now only renders this to do. And so yeah, this here is your to do to build this expander right here. Now by including these 3 text expanders here, I'm already giving you a hint into what the public API of this reusable component will look like. Because here we already used many of these props. And so from this you can kind of imagine what each of them does in order to achieve the 3 results that we saw here. So the challenge for you is now actually go ahead and implement this text expander using everything that we have learned up until this point. And if for some reason this is a bit difficult, then just imagine this as a collaboration between you and me, basically. So you build as much as you can on your own, and then if you can't move on anymore at some point, you simply watch the rest of the video where I will then basically help you leading this component. And if you want, you can of course also go crazy with this one and include even a lot more props than just the ones that you see here. So you can really do a lot of customization here if you want, but of course it's also more than enough to just do what we have here. So this is a really nice exercise which I hope you will complete, or at least part of it. And I see back here with my implementation. Okay, and let's get to work. And I will immediately start by copying all these prop names here. So selecting them one by one, and copy, and then we'll just now the text of the button can actually be customized. So that is what we have the prop of the collapse button text for. So let's get that. Place that here. And then we have some error. So let's see what's happening. We're not closing this then, so that doesn't look too good. And so here we already have one button. Now here then we have this like a very small button which doesn't have any text, and that's because only this second text extender is actually passing in the text for the collapse button text property. So that's because this text here, so this label of the button is different from the default button extender. But in code that you see, this will already have text. So if it's extended, then show the collapse button text, and if not, then show the extend button text. And now it says show less. And so the extender component here will then show collapse text instead of show less. So because it passes in this special prop that we have to be extended. So that's exactly this third situation right here. So if we reload this one here, then you see that the third text extender is by default already extended. Okay, so that's because extended is set to true. So here let's actually not use false, but really get this initial state from extended. And then we can set extended to false by default. So this is very similar to what we also did in our star array component. So there we also set the initial state based on our props, right? So by default we now have this lesson here already open, and so this one shows the entire text, while these ones here will now only show text. Now another thing is that in this case that the text is extended, here the text, the label of the button should be different, so it should be show less. Welcome to probably the most challenging section in this course, but also one of the most exciting ones and most rewarding ones. So up until this point, we have only focused on how React concepts and features work in practice. But now it's time to understand how things actually work internally inside React behind the scenes. So just like my other courses, this course also includes a really deep dive, which most students absolutely love. Because this information you're about to learn will not only make you a much better and more confident React developer, but it will also allow you to ace the most common React interview questions with all the confidence that you need in order to nail that job. And I would go as far as saying that this knowledge will actually put you right in the top 5% of all React developers. Now, again, this section is quite intense, and it should probably be in the advanced part of the course. But since there is so much important stuff that we need to talk about before moving on, I decided to place it right here. If at some point it becomes a bit too much, or if you become bored, please watch at least the final lecture of the section, where I'm briefly going to summarize everything we covered. So that video really is a must watch. But anyway, without further ado, let's dive right in and uncover how React works. Now, before we go learn about how React works behind the scenes, let's quickly set up and walk through a small demo project that we're going to need in a few lectures of this section. Now, this time around, we will do things a bit differently. So we will not create a new project using create React app. Instead, in the starter files, I already basically have that entire project for you to copy. So open up the starter files, and then here in this folder called how React works, let's copy this entire starter folder. So copy all of this right into the folder where we are building our project. And so then we call it how React works. So you see that here we actually have the source folder, we have the public folder, and also these other files that are always automatically created by create React app. But again, this time we are not doing that because, well, everything has been done already for us. And so now all we have to do is to take this folder, open it up in VS Code, like this, and then we need to install all the packages. So the node modules folder, which is the folder where all the npm packages are installed, is of course not here. So all the libraries like React, React DOM, and so on, they are not here. So we need to install them. But that's fortunately very easy. So let's open up our terminal here. It's here in view. And that's really small here. And as always, make sure that you are in the correct folder. And then all you have to do is to say npm install or npm I for short. So hit enter, and then this will install all the packages that are necessary for this create React application. So it will get this information here from this package.json file. Okay, and we see that it's already done, and so we can now start this project. So just write npm start. And then in my case here, it's asking me if I want to run the app on another port. So that's because I already had something running here on 3000. So that's basically the demo project, but let's close that for now actually. So just inspecting this, and then let's open up our app.js file as always. So this time around, in this section, I gave you this already started project so that you can now get the experience of looking at a project where someone already started writing some code. And that's exactly what we have here. So some code here has already been written, and so you cannot pretend that basically some other developer on your team wrote this. So it's extremely important that you be able to understand other developers' code, especially when you work on a team as a professional React developer someday. And so, before we now start this section, I just want us to quickly walk through this code here so I can explain you how it works on a high level, and then by doing so, you can see how we can effectively read code that we didn't write ourselves. So let's start in the app component here, and all that one does is include the tab component. And it passes the content in there, which is simply this array of objects here, so pretty standard. Then the tab component has some state variable here, which indicates the current tab. So it seems like this is a number. And then down here, we can see that the active tab state is used to render this tab content component using as the content array at the position of the currently active tab. So this at here is basically modern JavaScript, which is the same as this here. So basically reading something out of an array. And that array is this content array up here. So for example, if the state here was 2, then the content here in the tab would be 0, 1, 2. So it would be this object right here. Alright, let's just put this back here to this more modern form. And then let's check out what this tab content here actually is. And it's also always a good idea to take a look at the component tree. So let's make this here bigger. And so indeed we have the app, we have tab, and then we have the tab content in there. And of course we also have these 4 tabs, but we will leave them for a bit later. So in here, in the tab content, let's see what we have. We get the tab item, which is basically the content that we're going to use here. So we can double click on that, and then we see where it has been used. So we see that we use item.summary and item.details. Then we also see that we have 2 state variables here, so that's show details and set show details. And again, by double clicking, VS Code will then highlight all of them. So here we can see that we're doing some conditional rendering with this show details. And so yeah, by default this is true, and then only in that case we are displaying the item details. And then we change that state down here where we have set show details in this button. So this here is exactly that button. So if we click that, then here the text disappears. So this paragraph right here disappears. Right? Then we also have these 2 buttons down here, but we see that they have no event handler attached. So if we click here, then nothing happens. Then finally, we also have those cards here, and that's why we have this second state of likes. So you see that likes is indeed used here, and then this button here has the handle ink function. So this first one here, while the second button again has no handler. So here nothing happens, but here each time we click, basically 1 like is added there. And so that's because of the handle ink function. So what this one does is simply take the current likes and adding 1, and then setting that as the new likes state. Now notice for here we didn't use a callback function in order to set state based on the current state, but more about that later. So I think this component here is pretty clear, and so let's now go back here and see what these tabs here actually are. So here we have these 4 tabs, and notice how we are actually writing them one by one manually and not looping over some array. So our array has these 3 elements here, and so the first 3 elements, so these 3 are for those 3 objects, and then we have another one where the number is 3. But let's take a look at that a bit later. So here we have the num as a prop, we have the active tab, and we have the onClick. And as the onClick, we are simply passing the setActiveTab state setter function. Now let's go here into the tab and see what happens there. So basically a tab is just a button. So it's these buttons right here. And what happens when we click on this button is that the onClick function is called with the current number. So let's then actually go back to where these props are passed so that we can understand what the onClick and the num actually are. So onClick is setActiveTab, and num are these numbers here. So basically when we click on this first tab, it means that the active tab will get set to 0. And the same down here. So when we click on this tab right here, then the active tab will get set to 1, which is exactly what we have here. Then based on the state, as I explained in the beginning, we see that the tab content will be rendered, at least if that value is less or equal to. So if it's greater than 2, which happens in this case, then the different content will be displayed. So let's check it out. And so this one is simply this one div, which has a simple h4. Okay, so again, basically the goal of this other tab right here is just to display this different content component right here. So let's see that in action. And so, indeed, when we click on tab 2, you see that the content here changed. And so the title here, the text, are exactly what we have here in this second object. And then the same here. So here we now have the third object. So the title and the text. And finally, the last one is for, well, for the different content. And you saw that down here, actually, the component tree changed. Alright, and here, if we wrote any other number, like 0, then, of course, you see that number changed here. So that is always the number plus 1, and we get then the very first object. So now it says React is a library for building UIs, just like here. And also both of them are now marked active, which also happens inside that tab component. But of course, let's put it back to 2. And with this, I think it is pretty clear what this very small demo application does. But before you move on to the next lecture, make sure that you take some more time to analyze this code on your own so that you truly understand what exactly is happening here. So let's start the section with the React components, component instances, and React elements. Knowing about this difference will hopefully make it a bit more clear what actually happens with the components as you use them. And also, this is a pretty common interview question, so this topic is definitely worth learning about. And let's begin by taking another look